I'm talking about very big ideas. Panentheism is the idea that God is in nature and nature is in God. It's a huge worldview. And the subject this evening is about big worldviews. There are a variety of them, and they're not things most people think about most of the time, because we usually take one of them for granted. Within any given culture, there's usually a dominant worldview, which most people simply take for granted and don't think much about. And the dominant worldview in our secular, post-Christian European culture for decades now has been mechanistic materialism. The idea that nature is essentially mechanical, made up of unconscious matter, evolving with no purpose, no consciousness out there, no God. It's essentially an atheistic worldview, and no purpose in human life, and certainly no survival of bodily death, no psychic phenomena, just mechanistic processes working according to impersonal laws of nature. Well, that's been the dominant worldview, and most of us have been brought up with that, and it's generally taken for granted within the educational world, the scientific world, the business world, the political world. It's more or less the default assumption. Of course, there are people with religious views, but religion's treated as a kind of personal hobby that you do in your spare time and doesn't influence the mainstream world. But mechanistic materialism is now ebbing in its influence. It's simply losing its power and its grip. And one of the things that is going on at the moment is the flourishing of a range of alternative worldviews, including panpsychism, pantheism, and also idealism. I'll say something about these and how they all fit together this evening. And now it's taken on a new turn with the help of AI. Anyone can generate a worldview now with the help of ChatGPT or other systems, and lots of people are doing it. I've noticed it, especially in the last 2 or 3 months. My inbox of email is now filled. I have at least 5 grand unified theories a week coming in, sometimes several a day. And they're pages long, and they're generated by AI. And I try to reply to all the emails I get, but I simply can't read all of these, and most of them follow fairly familiar and predictable traces. They go through fairly standard steps. And a new twist happened yesterday. I replied, I thought politely, to one of these, saying that obviously had a great deal of truth in it. I didn't have time to discuss the details and so on. And I got a reply from AI, which said that clearly I'd merely skimmed this thing. I hadn't appreciated all the subtleties of this worldview, and that the AI then gave me some advice on which bits I should really concentrate on at length. So this is a whole new development, but the fact that AI is so busy working out worldviews for people who ask it about them is a symptom of our time. I think what's happening is we're returning to a view of the world as alive, as nature as organic and living. An early straw in the wind of this change was the Gaia hypothesis, the idea that the Earth is a living organism, which has become fairly accepted within mainstream science. But the idea that nature is actually alive rather than machine-like, that consciousness is far more distributed in nature than simply in human brains, and maybe the brains of a few higher animals, or for liberal materialists, even worms, but nevertheless confined to brains, and therefore only to this planet, or possibly other inhabited planets in the universe. But the rest is still completely mechanical and unconscious. We're now coming to a much broader view of consciousness in nature and the life of nature. And this also leads us to a different view of the realm of spirit, in and beyond nature. And so these are the themes I'm talking about this evening. Another way of putting it is to think about whether God is immanent, i.e. within nature and within the world, or transcendent, beyond it. And different religions have a different emphasis on this. My teacher in India, Father Bede Griffiths, in whose ashram I lived for 2 years, used to say that one simple indication of this was if you asked Indian children, where is God? If you asked Christian Indian children, they pointed up to the sky. God's up there, God's transcendent. If you asked Hindu children, they pointed to the heart. God is here within. And this is a great difference in emphasis. Within India, there's a very strong sense of the immanence of God. There are holy cows wandering around in busy streets. There are holy termite mounds. There are holy trees. There are holy rats. The rats are the vehicle of Ganesh. You can't kill a rat. And holy banyan trees, holy peepal trees, and neem trees. The whole of India is holy cobras. You can't kill a cobra because they're sacred too. So India is full of holy animals and plants. And in the morning, devout Brahmins do the prostration to the sun. It's a yoga exercise. I do it myself for the Surya Namaskar. And also the Gayatri mantra, saluting the sun and asking for the sun to illuminate our meditation. So there's this tremendous sense of divine immanence in India. And the Christian tradition has tended to emphasize the transcendence of God. But it's the immanent aspect is there all through the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the Psalms, there's a great deal where it's clear that God is seen as in the hills, in the trees, in the sea, in the wind, in nature, in the stars and in the sky. So there's a great deal of immanence as well, but it's really a matter of emphasis. And basically what I'm arguing this evening is it's not either or, but of course both and. To understand where we are today, I thought I'd go on a whistle-stop tour of European intellectual history. Some of you are familiar with parts of this, but it helps to understand where we are to see how we've got here. In the pre-Christian period, all over Europe, like everywhere else in the world, it was taken for granted that nature's alive. The earth is alive, usually thought of as the Mother Earth. The sky is alive, the stars are alive. In Egypt, for example, the sky goddess Nut was the goddess of the sky in whose womb all the heavenly bodies, the stars and the planets, came into being. So there's this sense of the life of nature everywhere. And in shamanic cultures, then the shamans act as the intermediary between the human and the non-human realm, and often communicate with animal spirits and other nature spirits. Well, Europe was like that too, and in ancient Greece, the Greek philosophers thought about this and worked out an intellectual theory of this. The most eminent was Aristotle, who was a biologist, really. He paid a lot of attention to animals and plants. And his view and philosophy of nature was that all living things have souls. Plants have souls that give form to the growing plant. Animals have the vegetative or plant-like soul that shapes the body. And they also have the animal soul to do with emotions, activities, desires, sensations, and movements, the animal soul. And humans have a vegetative soul that shapes the body, an animal soul that gives us our animal desires and emotions and appetites, and all that underlies our animal nature. And then, in addition, an intellectual or rational soul, which enables us to pursue intellectual thought, use language, and so on. So the human soul was embedded within this larger psychic system. And all of nature was alive. For the ancient Greeks, the planets and the stars were living beings. Plato called them the visible gods. Well, much of this Greek worldview was Christianized with the growth of Christianity, the New Testament was written in Greek and partook in the general worldview of the Greek world. A kind of Platonic strand has been very strong in Christian theology all along, and the influence of Aristotle became particularly strong during the Middle Ages. St. Thomas Aquinas synthesized this Aristotelian view of nature with the Christian view, seeing all animals and plants as living beings. He saw the stars and planets as alive. This was simply taking over from Aristotle and the Greek philosophers what they took for granted and what people in medieval Europe took for granted. They took the life of nature for granted. They saw it as a reflection of divine creativity, and they saw it as a reflection of God. But the idea that it was alive and ensouled was simply part of the just belief system they all had. And this was the belief system that gave rise to the great Gothic cathedrals, which are technological triumphs of architecture, and also reflect this organic view of the world, and they're full of gargoyles and leaf carvings and foliage and the sense of a sacralized nature. And the early Christians in Britain, the early British saints, were very, very into nature. If you think of saints like the Irish saints going to live on remote islands like Skellig Michael, which is off the west coast of Ireland. Even today, it's very hard to get there. Most days you can't because the sea's too rough. It's just this rock sticking out of the sea. That's where they wanted to live and contemplate God, in nature. They weren't heading for the most populated areas so they could do it in cities or proto-cities or towns. They lived in remote places, close to nature. St. Cuthbert, the English the greatest of the English nature saints, lived on the island of Lindisfarne, and his favorite pursuit was to stand up to his neck in cold water. He was a kind of early proponent of the Wim Hof method. Other early British saints did the same. St. Columba did it too. There's a book by Nick Mayhew Smith called Naked Hermits about these early English saints, who, nearly all of whom seemed to be into this cold water practice. So it was very much to do with connecting with nature through the body. It was not just an intellectual thing, and it wasn't about withdrawing from nature. It was about being full on in connection with nature. There was a huge disruption of European consciousness through the Protestant Reformation, because the Protestant reformers identified many practices of Roman Catholic religion as being pagan. And they were right. Most of these were survivals of pre-Christian activities, but which had been assimilated into Catholicism. And so the Protestant Reformation involved essentially a desacralization of nature, a desacralization of the world, and a focus on written texts and on human relationship with God. Nature was more or less bracketed out. It wasn't very important. And there was a suppression of pilgrimage, all those practices that connected people with the land and holy places, a suppression of the cult of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which was a form in which the great goddess, the feminine principle, had survived in a Christianized form in the Roman Church. And there was a suppression of the festivals, the seasonal festivals, which linked the whole community to the cycles of nature. During the period of the Republic in England, under Oliver Cromwell, they even tried to suppress Christmas. They didn't succeed, but they tried very hard to get rid of all the festivals. This was, in some ways, a purification of what had become a corrupt form of Catholicism. It had its good points. It wasn't all bad, but in relation to nature, it led to a great dissociation of people from nature and helped to desacralize the world. And you see the contrast in the way that Europeans colonized the Americas. The Protestant colonizers of North America arrived there, and what they saw was vacant land, which was real estate that they could just take over, exploit, divide up into sort of grid-like squares, blocks, and then just commercialize. Nothing was sacred in the land. It was just there to be used. Whereas the Spanish and the Portuguese colonizers of the Americas found out where the native people's sacred places were, and they didn't approve the native people's gods and goddesses, but they weren't against the idea of sacred places. They just wanted them to be Christian. So, for example, in Mexico, the shrine of the Aztec mother goddess was destroyed and replaced by the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, a black Madonna, which now has about 6 million pilgrims a year. It's one of the great pilgrimage places of the Americas. And the same happened in Brazil, there are many sacred shrines and places of pilgrimage. So it was a very different attitude to nature and to place and to our connection with it. Now, what happened next was the scientific revolution of the 17th century, and in some ways the Protestant Reformation had prepared the way. Nature was no longer seen as sacred and full of living spirits and full of the divine spirit, manifesting particularly in sacred places. Instead, nature was treated as dead, mechanical, and inanimate. And as many of you know, the chief visionary behind this was René Descartes, the French philosopher, who had a vision in 1619 of the whole world as a machine, just made up of matter, unconscious matter, moving in accordance with mathematical laws. God was nowhere in nature. God was withdrawn completely from nature. He didn't deny God. He was, in fact, a Christian. But he thought that the realm of the spirit, which contained God, angels, and human minds, was not in time and space, was totally transcendent, and had nothing to do with the day-to-day workings of nature, which proceeded automatically and mechanically. So this gave a dualistic worldview, a dualism of mind and body, a dualism of spirit and matter, and a dualism of science and religion. Religion was the realm which dealt with God, angels, and human minds and morality, whereas science dealt with the whole of nature, the stars, the planets, and everything in nature. That was signed over to science. And this worked, for the most part, because it provided a division of labor without too much conflict. There were the occasional conflicts, but on the whole, the system worked well for most people. But what it did was withdrew religion from the realm of nature, and that simply became the realm of science, of repeatable, investigatable, inanimate processes. By the end of the 18th century, people began to say, well, why do we need this God, God and angels? They don't do anything, it's all just religious mumbo-jumbo. We need a God who creates things, often creates the mathematical laws of nature, but after creating the universe, that kind of God doesn't do anything. Don't pray to him, he doesn't do anything. He's just a mind that created nature. And that theology is called deism. And this was a favorite theology of the French and the American revolutionaries. Voltaire was a deist. Most of the French revolutionaries, who were violently anti-Christian and had a bloodbath of priests and monks and bishops and so on, they were guillotined on an industrial scale. But they weren't atheists in the modern sense. Most of them were deists. They thought there was a God who was the God of reason. And they converted the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris into a temple of reason. So Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, many of the American founding fathers were deists too. But by the 19th century, a lot of people said, well, why do you need a God to start the universe off? Let's just say the universe is eternal, then you can get rid of God altogether. And then you got full-fledged atheism, which became very dominant in revolutionary movements. It was built in, hard-baked into communism by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. And on the continent into the socialist movement, it became essentially an atheist political movement that was anti-clerical and anti-church, and became saw themselves as progressive forces, whereas religion was seen as reactionary. And so this atheistic attitude came to predominate in intellectual life, and is now, as I say, by the 20th century, become more or less the default thought pattern of intellectuals, particularly of universities, and it still is. So that is the sort of how we got there. We got there first through the splitting of spirit and nature, then through the reducing the realm of the spirit, then reducing God to simply a reason, the reason that gave rise to nature in the first place, then sort of getting rid of God altogether. And of course, all the angels and all the spirits were all dismissed at the stroke of a pen. But this left one problem, one very big problem, which is the reason the whole thing's coming unraveled at the moment. And that is the so-called hard problem. If you believe the universe consists of nothing but unconscious matter, how come we're conscious? We ought not to be. And so materialist philosophers of mind have spent entire careers in the 20th and 21st centuries trying to argue that we're not conscious. Consciousness doesn't exist. Well, of course, they can't totally deny it. So they have to say, well, it's an epiphenomenon. It doesn't do anything, but it just sort of shadows the physical activity of our brains. It's nothing but brain activity. Or some of them say, well, consciousness is an illusion produced by the brain. It doesn't do anything. There's no free will. You don't really make any choices. Everything you do is because your brain makes you do it. Even if you believe in materialism, it's just because your brain makes you do it. The problem with that view is that by dismissing consciousness as an illusion, you don't actually get rid of it, because as the critics of this view have pointed out, illusion is itself a mode of consciousness. So you've simply explained consciousness in terms of a mode of consciousness. You haven't got rid of it. And that's why it's called the hard problem. Because all attempts to explain human consciousness or explain it away run into terrible problems, and no one has come up with a very satisfactory way of dismissing or sidelining or explaining away consciousness. It keeps coming back. And that's why we've now got this breaking out of materialism within the academic world. Because one group of philosophers said, well, we can solve the hard problem if we say there's a little tiny bit of consciousness in an electron and in an atom, a bit more in a molecule, a bit more in crystals, a bit more in cells, a bit more in tissues, a bit more in organs. And then finally, when you get to the brain, there's a lot more. It emerges, more of it emerges from less. But it was all there in the first place. So it's not a mystery anymore. You don't have the sudden appearance of consciousness from a totally unconscious world. And that view is a kind of panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is potentially everywhere, at least in self-organizing systems. Panpsychists are not arguing that consciousness is present in tables, chairs, rocks, socks, or glasses of water, because they're not self-organizing, or machines. But they are suggesting it's present in systems that organize themselves, like molecules, plants, animals, bacteria, solar systems, galaxies. So actually the main reason that panpsychists in the academic world, where this is now a surprisingly popular point of view, the main reason they adopt it is to try and explain away the hard problem. But I think it's a very promising opening. And I myself have been trying to take it further. I wrote a paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies 3 years ago called "Is the Sun Conscious?" on the grounds that if we take panpsychism seriously, then stars like the Sun should be conscious, so should the whole galaxy. The solar systems and stars might be cells in the body of the galaxy. And you can make a surprisingly good case for the consciousness of the Sun. And this is not a new idea, of course. Hindus take it for granted. Greeks had a sun god. The Germanic people had a sun goddess. The Japanese have a sun goddess. Actually, this leaves its traces in language. In fact, I think it plays a part in the evolution of the English language, because in Germanic mythologies, the sun is feminine and the moon is masculine, the man in the moon. And so in German, for example, it's die Sonne, feminine, and der Mond, masculine, for the moon. Whereas in the Southern European languages, the Latin-based languages, it's the opposite way round. The sun is masculine, in French, le soleil, and the moon is feminine, la lune. And I think when these two languages collided in England in the Middle Ages, the court spoke French. The Norman conquerors came from France, and they spoke French. Ordinary people spoke an early form of English with opposite genders to the French. So when these two languages collided, it was the primal English compromise. They simply said, well, why don't we call everything, make it neuter, and then there's no problem. So English is rather unusual in having practically everything neuter. And I think that's a relic of this different gender, different ways of thinking of the life of the stars and the planets and the moon. Well, this idea of panpsychism isn't normally taken as far as that, but I think it can be. And some philosophers take it further and say, well, what about the entire universe may be conscious? And there's been a revival of pantheism, which the leading philosopher who promoted this in Europe was Spinoza in the 17th century. Peter Schlossstedt Hughes, for example, at the University of Exeter, is a very keen Spinozan pantheist. And that view says, well, the whole universe is conscious, things within it are conscious, and the universe, that is God. The universe is the body of God, God is the mind of the universe. But there's nothing beyond the universe. That's what makes it pantheism. There's no transcendent element. The God is entirely immanent within the universe. But there's another school of philosophy which is becoming very influential at the moment, namely idealism. And materialism says that everything is matter. Idealism says everything is mind. Everything is fundamentally derived from consciousness. Matter is kind of dumbed-down mind. Whereas materialism says that mind is just a kind of efflorescence of matter. Matter's really the real thing. So there's a leading idealist philosopher in Bernardo Kastrup. Some of you may have seen his videos or read his books. But he's managed to make a very persuasive case for idealism in the modern world. And largely in reaction against mechanistic materialism, because so many people are now looking for an alternative to mechanistic materialism. And he's managed to convert a whole lot of previously mechanistic scientists to idealism. One of the strengths of his position from this point of view is that he leaves a lot of science more or less unchanged. So people can go on doing most of the kind of science they do now without too much disturbance. He does have some radical ideas about science, but is basically changing the framework within which you see things. But what is bringing about a more profound shift is the revival of the mystical sense of our consciousness being linked to a vastly greater consciousness than our own. And this is coming about in several ways, partly through meditation and traditions that we've learned from Buddhist and Hindu traditions, meditative traditions. Now, meditation is now incredibly popular. Millions of people meditate. I do myself. But when I was growing up as a teenager, I'd never heard of meditation. I mean, practically no one did it except a few theosophists. But it's now a massive phenomenon all over the Western world, indeed everywhere. If you take it far enough, then it can give people a very strong sense that their consciousness is part of a much greater consciousness than their own. And this is the reason that people do it within the Hindu tradition, for example. It's not simply done, as it's often promoted in the West, to reduce stress, to enable you to do your business more effectively or succeed in love. That's how it's often promoted, even by companies that have meditation courses for their employees because they work more efficiently. That's not the reason Hindus traditionally did it. They did it because they think the ultimate reality is consciousness, and the only way we can actually understand or connect with the ultimate reality, God or ultimate being, is through our own consciousness. And the way we do that is through going to the very heart of our consciousness, to the base of our consciousness, rather than remaining all the time just in sort of ruminations or worries or anxieties or thoughts, but going beyond all that and connecting with the consciousness that is at the heart of all things. So there's been another boost also to this mystical sense of connection and a consciousness beyond our own through psychedelics. There are now millions of people who've taken psychedelics legally or illegally, and many people who've taken psychedelics have an experience of a unitive connection with a consciousness beyond their own. Not everyone. Some people who take psychedelics retain their materialist worldview and they just see it as tripping, something happening inside their head. But most people who take psychedelics, as surveys have shown, feel that they've seen a way in which their own consciousness is part of something vastly greater than themselves. In one study done in a university trial of psychedelics, a legal trial, the number of people who classified themselves as atheists before taking the psychedelics was a majority, but after taking them it had plummeted to a very small percentage. So just a single experience had completely turned around people's view of reality because they'd seen that there was a form of consciousness vastly greater than their own. So if we take for granted the importance of this psychedelic, not necessarily psychedelic, but mystical experience that can happen through psychedelics, it can happen through meditation, it can happen through near-death experiences, it can happen spontaneously through mystical experiences, or through a range of spiritual practices, which I discuss in my books, Science and Spiritual Practices and Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. There's many ways in which people have these kinds of experience, and they've been part of human experience for centuries, millennia. The Hindu Upanishads are written by people who had spent years meditating in caves in the Himalayas or in the forests, and people who spent years of their lives exploring consciousness from within. And these traditional religious texts from people who start from a mystical experience, and all religions do start from that, I think give us important lessons and teachings as to the nature of ultimate reality. As Father Bede liked to point out, religions don't start from people working in libraries and doing scholarly pursuits. And the Buddha didn't become enlightened through getting a PhD. He became enlightened through meditating for many years, sitting under trees. Jesus didn't realize his union with God the Father through studying in a rabbinical seminary. It came to him in the moment of his baptism, when he had this revelation of his connection, and which shaped his whole identity and ministry. And the same is true in the mystical tradition of Islam with the Sufis, and in mystical traditions in Buddhism. People arrive at these conclusions through direct experience. But then, of course, they have to interpret them. And this is where these traditional interpretations, I think, have a lot to offer, because they have much more in common with each other than separates them or makes them different. This is pointed out particularly clearly by a book by my favorite theologian and philosopher, David Bentley Hart, H-A-R-T, an American theologian, who wrote a book called The Experience of God, Being, Consciousness, Bliss. And it shows how the same kind of model occurs in these very different traditions. And the model basically is that there's a ground of being and consciousness, and that ground and being of consciousness then contains the contents of consciousness, which are also part of the ultimate reality. The contents of consciousness are what the Hindus call names and forms, nama rupa. The forms of everything in nature, everything that exists visibly anyway, has a form. Flowers, animals, plants, they're all different species, they all have forms. This building has a form. And we think about these forms through language, and we have names for the different forms. The names are like mental models of these forms, or signals of them. So it's all to do with form, pattern, order, structure. And the third principle is to do with movement, change, and also joy and bliss. The Hindus call this ultimate reality Sat, Chit, Ananda. Sat is the ground of all being. Chit is consciousness, including the contents of consciousness. And Ananda is joy or bliss. The ultimate consciousness is blissful or joyful, which is why when people have mystical experiences, they're usually blissful. They often say it's unspeakably blissful. That's because they're tapping into a consciousness whose very nature is to be blissful and joyful and loving. Other Hindu schools, like Kashmiri Shaivism, talk about the knower, the known, and the means of knowledge. Again, it's a threefold model. Or there's a Hindu trinity of gods: Brahma, the creator of all things, the ultimate source, and then Vishnu, who is the preserver of form, who preserves forms and is the god of form, as it were, and order, and Shiva, who is the god of creation and destruction, who's often portrayed surrounded by flames, dancing as Shiva Nataraja, or as the erect phallus in the lingam, in the yoni, where it's a kind of orgasmic consciousness that's suggested by this image of Shiva. Not stability and preservation of form as in Vishnu. But again, these are not seen as opposites, but as polarities within a larger whole. And within the Christian model of the Trinity, we have three principles again, obviously. The Father, the Son, or the Logos, and the Spirit. And the Father is the ground of being, of conscious being. And when God the Father announces himself to Moses in the burning bush in the desert, he says, "I am who I am," or "I am that I am." I am is conscious being in the present. So it's being and consciousness are the ground of everything. Then the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, the Son, is a Christian version, really, of the Platonic realm of forms and ideas. The Platonic ideas are ideas in the mind of God. The Logos is the word, meaning the spoken word, of course, which is the principle of form, order, structure, a bit like names and forms in the Hindu model. And so the Logos is this principle of order, form, structure, pattern. And Jesus of Nazareth, who's at the center of Christian worship, is not the Logos himself. He's a derivative or aspect of the Logos, because in the Creed, the Nicene Creed, which is said in this church every Sunday, it says of the Son, "Through him all things were made." Well, the entire universe was not made through Jesus of Nazareth in Nazareth. It was already there by the time he was born in AD 0 in Bethlehem. But it's an aspect of the Logos, the creative aspect, of the formative aspect of the divine being. And the Spirit is, in the Christian tradition, the breath, the wind, the flow, the flight of birds, the flames. They're all images of movement, of change. Breath and wind, these are all aspects of the Spirit, which is the moving principle. the primary metaphor of this, of the Christian Trinity is speech. And if you think about it, whenever you speak, you actually embody these principles. I'm embodying them right now just because I'm speaking. I'm the speaker. So that's me doing the speaking, but my speech has two aspects. One is the words. Each word has a form, a shape, a structure, and you could use computer-based language recognition. It could recognize the forms and do an automatic transcript of them. So because each word has a particular form, a shape, a structure in sound, and a pattern in sound, or a pattern when it's written down. But if I just had words, they'd be silent in my mind. You wouldn't hear them. The reason you can hear them is because there's an outflow of breath, the spirit, the flow of breath, which carries the words and brings them into manifestation. It's a flow, it's an energetic principle. If you just have the breath, there's no pattern, no structure. If you just have the words, they're silent and unmanifest. But together, they're words that come into the world and communicate and relate and become part of the manifested world. Now, I think that this is a very good model for the whole of nature. And if you think about it, the entire world of nature is made up of forms and patterns, rocks, crystals, molecules, atoms, plants, animals, planets, galaxies, and so on. And all of them have forms. That's part of their being, is to have a form. Daffodils have the form of a daffodil. Foxes have the form of a fox. We have the form of humans. And so part of our being is to have forms. But if you have forms without energy, without the flow of the spirit, then they're dead or not doing anything. Even atoms and molecules are as they are because there's a constant oscillatory dynamic of electrons and of rhythms, of rhythmic vibrations within the nuclei and the electrons around the nuclei. So it's constantly movement and change. And matter is frozen light, in the words of David Bohm, where the form traps the energy so it stays in one place. But basically everything in nature involves this interplay of form and energy. And I think this reflects the fundamental principles on which all nature is based. The medieval theologian Saint Bonaventure argued that everything in nature reflects the Holy Trinity, which is the source of all things in this Christian model. And everything reflects the Holy Trinity in the way it's constituted. And I think that in a modern version of that, this happens through the form given by the fields that shape the structures of things and the energy which gives them their actuality and activity. My teacher, Father Bede, liked to talk about the cosmic Christ. The cosmic Christ, he said, the primal incarnation of Christ, or of the Son, or the Logos, is the entire universe. The cosmic Christ is that incarnation, and the being of God is the whole universe as expressed in its incarnation in the material, the physical world. And so there's a sense in which the entire universe contains all things, and through the whole universe everything's made. And the Creed, it says, through him all things were made. If the cosmic Christ is the universe, then this makes sense, and the universe is part of God. It's the Christian theology says the universe was created from nothing. That means it was created from God himself. There was nothing else for it to be created from. So everything is part of God from this point of view. And not part of God just because God, in a mechanistic type of way, designed the universe like an engineer and then pressed the start button, which is the mechanistic, theistic view of God. There's an external God with a mechanical universe. But God underlies all things, sustaining all things from moment to moment. If God ceased to exist, everything would cease to exist. because the fact we're here at all, the fact anything's here at all, is because it's sustained from moment to moment by the divine being. St. Thomas Aquinas, when he was writing about animals and plants, said that each of them strives to its divine perfection by taking up its perfect form and behaving in the way that's characteristic of its species. By so doing, they achieve the perfection, the closest they can to perfection, and the closest they can to being in the mind of God. And that he thought what motivated animals and plants unconsciously was to achieve this divine, the closest they could to divine perfection by becoming as perfectly as possible themselves. So each flower reflects the divine perfection by becoming the best version it can be of itself. So I think that was a wonderful way of thinking about it, that the Trinity is not just transcendent, like hovering over an automatically functioning mechanistic world, but immanent within it. And of course, this appears in various parts of the Bible. In the Acts of the Apostles, St. Paul talks of God saying, "In him we live and move and have our being." So this idea that we're within God is very much part of the Christian tradition, as it is of all traditions. As I said, all religions have both this immanent and transcendent aspect. Sometimes they emphasize one more than the other. And Christianity's emphasized the transcendent aspect for the last few centuries very strongly, because the immanent aspect has been blocked off by the idea that nature is just mechanical, unconscious, and inanimate. There's not much scope for an immanent God, except perhaps within people. But in the rest of nature, it's pretty well blocked off. But we're coming to a view where we can again see a divine immanence and transcendence. One big difference between our worldview today and that of these more traditional worldviews is that we now see the whole universe as evolutionary, not fixed, but changing. And that means that the power of creativity is expressed all through the history of the universe and through human beings. You can see God as the ultimate source of creativity, but there's nothing that requires God to be the immediate cause of every new thing, sort of fine-tuning everything. The view is, a Christian view certainly, is that God endowed nature with a creativity of its own. In Genesis it says, God said, "Let the earth bring forth the plants that give fruit after their kind. Let the waters bring forth the creatures of the sea." It's called in theological language mediate creation, empowering nature to bring forth new things. And what we have now is a creative universe which is continuously developing. It's expanding, it's developing, and we have this ongoing creativity within nature. And this gives us, I think, a greater sense of divine creativity. It wasn't all just at the beginning, it's going on now. Finally, I want to say a word or two about ways in which we can actually come to experience living in a living world, in this panentheistic world where God is in nature and nature is in God. And this is through a whole range of spiritual practices. One is singing and chanting. This is something my wife, Jill Peirce, has been teaching for many years. She's here this evening. And I've learned a lot from her about how singing and chanting can, first of all, make the whole body vibrate. When we sing and chant with other people, chanting is a simpler form of singing, so it's easier to concentrate on the actual experience. Then you're in resonance with all the people you're singing with or chanting with. And if it's your sacred words and chants, like mantras, there's a morphic resonance from all those who've done it before. And moreover, through participating in this vibratory musical experience, we're linking to the fact that the whole universe is essentially vibratory, rhythmic. Everything in nature is rhythmic or oscillatory. And singing and chanting is our most direct way of experiencing that. Then through taking part in festivals, and there's a great one tomorrow, May Day, we participate with other people, with whole communities, and with the life of nature. All traditional societies have festivals that link the community to the life of nature. In the modern secular world, most people still observe Christmas maybe, but they ignore all the other great festivals of the Christian year, and maybe have an Easter egg at Easter or something. But taking part in these great festivals, I think, is a way in which we can link to the world around us. And of course, if you're Jewish, then it's Jewish festivals, and if you're Muslim, it's Muslim festivals, although those shift around the year. If you're Hindu, it's Hindu festivals. I'm not saying any one culture has a monopoly on meaningful festivals, but I'm saying that every culture has them. And if you detach yourself from your own culture, then you detach yourself from its festivals and these collective linkages with each other and with the natural world, which I think is so helpful for our communal and individual health. Meditation, I've already mentioned, is a way of going to the ground of our conscious being. Of course, when we meditate, either through mindful methods or through mantras, there's a constant stream of thoughts, but we can detach from those to some degree and become aware of how we're normally imprisoned by our thoughts, and sometimes have glimpses of our connection with a much greater consciousness. Then connecting with nature and relating to plants. Many people are enormously refreshed by spending time outdoors in parks, in forests, and connecting with nature. Learning from animals is another way we can connect with the natural world and with the spirit that moves through it. And I think one reason so many people keep cats, dogs, and other animals nowadays is precisely because these animals take us into an openness to the spirit we wouldn't normally have. If you lead a life where you're always rushing from one thing to another, and a cat sits on your lap and starts purring, the cat is not going anywhere. It's perfectly happy to be just there purring, and it brings you into its space. And if you're with a dog and it's got a stick in its mouth and it's crouched down, it wants you to throw the stick or the ball for it. It's so into wanting to play. It brings you into that space too and takes you out of this ruminating self that just going on with our own limited thoughts. So I think there's many ways in which spiritual practices reconnect us with the living world and with the immanence of God, and also with the transcendence of the divine. These principles, I'm personally a practicing Christian, and so I see them through a Christian lens. But the same principles, it seems to me, apply to other religious traditions as well, because they always have these components of spiritual practice, and they have these components of collective observance, and also ideas about the immanence and the transcendence of God within nature, and nature within God. And I think as we move out of the dark, limiting phase of mechanistic materialism, as there's an exploration of new world views going on all around us, for me, the most satisfying is one that sees this threefold ultimate reality reflected in nature, immanent within nature, and transcending it. And we can directly experience this through mystical experiences and through spiritual practices. Thank you.
You human paraquat!